why don't we just start off with the significance of being on the last boat and what brought you to this story?
Well, so Frances, you just described something that was resonated with me. That's all I knew when I was a kid too, the last boat out of Shanghai. And that's really all I knew about my mother's story. My aunt would say it. And of course, that last boat had that feeling of or else, you know. And as time went on, you had heard the last boat, the last plane, and so did I. I talked to more and more people who said, oh, our relatives were on the last boat, or the last plane, or the last train. And it became clear that there was no way that any boat, plane, or train could have held all these people who said they were on the last one, like yours, mine, and so many people I had talked to. And so I became sort of curious, what did this mean? What, why did people feel such a sense of panic that if they didn't get on this last thing, that something terrible would have happened? And so, so I was a journalist then. It was something that I thought I wanted to find out more about. And then I heard this story, and I guess I'll just share with you one piece of what moved me to kind of get off of just the curiosity to really act on this. And so, my chair this way.
You're more centered.
I'm more centered. It's good to be centered. And I think I'll try this here.
Does this work? All right. Wow.
It works.
So this is a story that I heard, and it was already, I had spent, for some of you, a lifetime. I mean, I was in my 50s when I heard this story, and was already thinking about what is the last boat out of Shanghai? What does that mean? And then I heard this story, and it was told to me about a little girl, and somebody who was already in her 70s, but she talked about when she was 6 years old, and the only name she knew she had then was Little Sister, Mimi, and her father, Baba, was about to take her on a trip. And so they lived just outside of Shanghai. This was just before Japan was about to invade Shanghai and China and start World War II in China, which was 1937. America's war with Japan began in 1941. So 4 years earlier than that, China was at war. It was by itself in the world, just trying to stave off this terrible, brutal, and cruel enemy. And so as the war was about to happen, people knew that war was coming. And so they were terrified. There was already not enough food in China. People sometimes had to decide if they were only going to have one meal that day for the family. There wasn't enough for everybody to eat. And they would, who would eat first? Who would get the best parts, which might not have been, meat was rare. It was just who would eat and who wouldn't eat. And so at that time, families had to make a lot of hard decisions, hard choices, and so this little girl named Mei was about to go on a trip with her father, Baba. Baba announced that he would take little sister on a train ride to Suzhou, 60 miles away toward Shanghai. She remembered every moment of that journey, for she had been giddy that Baba had chosen her, not one of her brothers. She sat on her father's lap, her eyes glued to the window, mesmerized by the neat rice fields and towns just like hers sweeping by in a blur on the train. When they arrived in Suzhou, she saw men and women dressed in fine silk fabrics and even foreign outfits, unlike her mother and father, who wore rough traditional dress. When they reached Suzhou, Baba flagged down the driver of a wooden moon-wheeled cart. After a twisting, bumpy ride over arched stone bridges and canals lined by weeping willows, they finally came to a stop at a small store. Inside, her father spoke to the shopkeepers in a low voice, while she stood waiting by the door, looking out at the parade of vendors and hawkers on the street. Soon Baba called for her and told her to stand still by him. The shopkeepers looked into her mouth and they squeezed her thin arms. When they were finished poking and prodding her, One of them took her by the hand and led her toward another room. As she turned to look for her father, she saw his back as he headed toward the door. "Baba, Baba," she shouted after him. He didn't turn around. "Baba, come back," she cried. How could he leave without her? The stranger gently pushed her into a small, dank storeroom and locked the door. Alone and terrified of what might lurk in the darkness, at first she could only whimper. Then she steeled herself and called for her father as hard as she could until she grew hoarse and couldn't yell anymore. Exhausted, she sobbed herself to sleep. When the little girl awakened on the musty dirt floor, she thought she had had a terrible nightmare. But when she tried to open the door, it wouldn't budge. She could see the glare of daylight around the cracks. Once again, she screamed for her father. Baba never came. So this was a story I heard when I was already in my 50s, and it was told to me by my mother. And my mother told me this story as a secret she had kept for more than 70 years. She hadn't told anybody. She hadn't told us. I had no idea. She hadn't told my father, her husband. She had always said to me when I would say as a little kid, "Mom, can you tell me something about growing up in China?" Because as a kid growing up in New Jersey, everybody would say, "Go back where you came from." Well, I came from New Jersey. And so, but I knew they were saying go back to China, where I'd never been. And so I would ask my mom, "Tell me something about life in China when you were a girl." And she would always say, "That was wartime, a bad memory." And so that was it. And I grew up thinking there was nothing to know. Until one day when I was in my 50s and my mother was in her 70s, I kind of was having dinner with her and that childhood mantra came out and I just said, "Gee, Mom, too bad you can't tell me something about when you were growing up as a girl in China." And this time she said, "All right, you want to know? I'll tell you." And so this story was what she told me. And then she continued with another story and another story and another story about her life. So I learned about a life that my mother had that I had never heard about before. And she had kept it a secret, I think, because of the shame and stigma, especially in those days, you know, about having been an abandoned girl. Her parents left her behind. Some of the stories she told me were about how cruel the other children were to her, saying, "Oh, you don't know your roots, nobody will ever want you, you'll never find a family, nobody will ever care about you in your whole life." And so because of that, she kept it a secret and didn't even tell us as kids. And so here I was already curious about what this last boat out of Shanghai meant. And my mother had been, you know, starting with such a hard life as a little girl and making her way through war and occupation and civil war and all of the troubles that that means in a poor country like China was at that time. And she made it on the last boat out of Shanghai to come to America. And so that's kind of where I started with this. That kind of pushed me to think, well, what did this mean for my mother? What about other people? Was my mother's story so different? Was she the only one like that? And I found out actually by starting trying to reach other people, and somebody's phone, if you want to turn that off, that would be great. Whoever, thank you. And if you have a phone, please remember to do that. But so anyway, then I started looking for other people and to try to see. I actually did find that there were many, many, many children whose parents couldn't feed them anymore, couldn't take care of them anymore, had to give them up somehow, had to worry about what would happen to them. And in my mother's case, hers gave her away. And so that was the beginning. That was my commitment to saying, I want to know more about this. And I started digging more and ended up finding more than 100 people who had lived through war and crisis and exodus. And so, anyway, that was the beginning.
So that's an amazing beginning. And then you spent 12 years researching and writing this book. And what were some of the challenges that you faced while doing this research? This history, it seems, hasn't been written before.
Well, in fact, this book, number one, it did take me it took me 12 years to actually, from the start of that moment, say, I'm going to try to write a book. And I had no idea it was going to take me 12 years. But what I soon discovered, in fact, some of you might not even be 12 years old. Are you 12? No, okay. Well, so I started this book without any idea how long it would take. But I soon discovered that there wasn't a single book, a single PhD dissertation, not a single master's thesis on this topic. This was a forgotten exodus, and I tried to find out, well, how many people does this affect? Well, millions and millions of people had fled China during this time, and not necessarily because they were anti-communist or that they loved the old government, which actually many people hated and had caused a terrible crisis and collapse of China, but they were afraid. They were afraid of actually, having lived through 12 years of war and occupation, 8 years by a foreign invader that led to, hundreds of millions of people dying, then followed immediately by a civil war that also not only led to people dying from war, but because it was a civil war and the government was no longer working, people really didn't even have food. They didn't know, they could turn on their lights, one light bulb in their place for maybe, 10 minutes a night. And life was so hard that then when they had news that the Communist Army was coming and they wanted to get Shanghai, which was the jewel of China. It was the biggest, the richest, the most industrial city, the most western city of China. And so at that point, people started to flee. But there aren't any records of that. I tried to get some idea of how many left Shanghai. And one of the people I interviewed was one of the top sociologists and demographers in all of China of that period, but is specializing in Shanghai. And Shanghai was a city of 6 million. New York was just barely that many in the 1940s. And so Shanghai ranked up there with New York, London, Paris, and Berlin. That was it. If you were an intellectual, a scientist, a person of the world, an adventurer, and you went to Asia, Shanghai was one of your must-stop places. It was known as the Paris of the Orient. People like Albert Einstein, Charlie Chaplin, George Bernard Shaw, the top intellectuals of the world at that time went to Shanghai. And so there weren't any records for me to find. So that was hard. There weren't any other books about this in English. It's not like there were networks of people who had fled Shanghai at that point. And if you can imagine chaos, just total chaos of people spending a year, months, a year planning to think, should I stay or should I flee? If we stay, if my family stays, what will happen? What could happen to us? We could die. My children might not survive. If I flee, where will I go? Most countries don't want us. Australia at the time had a whites-only policy. They couldn't go to Australia. Europe was still recovering from World War II. Why go there? They wouldn't have a job there. Hong Kong already had 1 million refugees of people fleeing there. Taiwan, maybe you could go there. 2 million people from China did go, but they were all loyalists of the old regime. They might have been soldiers, they might have been officials. If you weren't part of the Nationalist Party, you were going to be suspected to be a possible communist infiltrator. So it wasn't a simple matter, and everybody had to debate, should we go, should we go, should we stay? And as the Nationalists left Shanghai, they took everything of value. I found records that said they took toothpaste, they took screws, they took anything that would have been useful. They had already taken the entire treasury of China, so there was no money left in China, no gold left. They had taken all the records they could take, and what they couldn't take, they burned. So if there were records about these people, they didn't exist anymore. And when the communists came in, they were inheriting a country in complete chaos and disorder. So the last thing they were going to do was track people who were leaving. Instead, they were trying to figure out how to feed people, how to keep the lights on, how to get rid of the mines that were, or the railroad tracks that had been blown up by the nationalists if they left. So they inherited a mess. And so the biggest challenge for me was just to be able to begin to find information that could help fill in the blanks. And so that's part of what took 12 years.
Over this time, these 12 years of research, you interviewed hundreds of people, and then you ended up bringing it together. You have 4 main characters in the book. Can you introduce us? Well, tell us about that process. How did you go from the hundreds of stories and hundreds of scholars, and how did you bring it down to 4 people and then introduce them to us?
So this is a nonfiction book. It's not a novel. The people are all real people. All the stories are based on, the 100+ people that I interviewed who had lived through this, and then the, hundreds of scholars and archives and things, newspapers of every kind, including many in English that existed on, daily newspapers in Shanghai in English, who would think of that, but there they were. And the thing about it is Shanghai had more than 6 million people. And there's a stereotype about Shanghai people, right? Some of you might know that people from Shanghai are considered to be the snobs, the arrogant people of China, the ones who think they're better than everybody, the ones who think they thought of everything first, the ones who take credit for everything, even if they didn't. And so that was a stereotype. Oh, and also that they were all rich. So the thing, rich Shanghainese, is a combination of words that even exists today. And so I knew that wasn't true. You can't stereotype 6 million people and say that they were all the same. Plus, this was a city that was a major conflict going on constantly. There were people who were very pro-nationalist. They were the old regime. There were people who hated the nationalists. And they had to worry because if you were a critic of the government under martial law, you could be shot on the spot, and people were. There are many newspaper accounts of people who were just stopped on a busy street corner. How many of you have ever been in Shanghai? A number of you have been to Shanghai. Well, I have a map in this book, and I try to describe as much as possible locations of where people were. There were, if you can imagine those busy, bustling streets today, good chances are that people were shot right on those spots, and many things had happened then. But so how I went about it was wanting to find a variety of people. I didn't want all their stories to be the same. I was tracking people from childhood. I started with 2 girls. I chose 2 girls and 2 boys because gender makes a difference under times of war. The boys were allowed to ride their bicycles, even, go out and about, go places, see things, do things as children, even though there was war and Japanese soldiers everywhere. The girls, had to hide. Many of the girls, there were stories about being grabbed by soldiers and never being seen again. Girls cut their hair to look like boys. A lot of times they would smear mud or dirt on their faces so that to disguise themselves in a way, or wore boys' clothes. And I talked to a lot of women, 80-year-old women, who said when they were little girls they dressed like boys so that they wouldn't be kidnapped or taken away. And so their experiences were different. So I had 2 boys and 2 girls. I had some who came from poor backgrounds, one, Benny, was the son of a very prominent Chinese family, and his father made the choice during the occupation by Japan to join in with the Japanese. So he became he's a historical figure. If any of you do any research on Shanghai history, you'll find his name, Pan Zhijie. And Pan Zhijie was a collaborator. He was a traitor. So you can imagine that under the enemy occupation, this man's lifestyle was fabulous. They had the luxuries, every extravagance you can think of. They ate caviar, had fancy wine, aged scotch, smoked fancy cigars, lived in the nicest mansions you can think of because they took them all from people who were fleeing. And that was their wonderful life. For Benny, who was the son of this man, well, we know how that war went. Japan lost the war, so the collaborator with the Japanese, their family fortune suddenly completely reversed. And so then Benny's life changed. So Benny's was almost able to leave on one of the last trains, I'm sure he would say, out of Shanghai, but he didn't. He pushed his sister on a train, and he said, "You have a chance at a life. You take this life." And so I follow his sister to Hong Kong, which was swarming with refugees at the time, and I stay with Benny to find out what his life was in China as the revolution happened. One was this little girl named Bing, later, the one I read to you about, who was my mother. Another little girl was the daughter of nationalist officials. So her father was a freedom fighter in that. He was a patriot. He was fighting against the Japanese. And then when the revolution came, he was on the losing side. So for her, she had grown up at a time of war. Her whole life, from the time she was 2, was running from this place to that place because they were running away from the Japanese. And then when the revolution, 1949, was happening, the father knows they have to go away because there's no way a former nationalist would have any kind of a chance. And so they flee to Taiwan, and I follow her to Taiwan. And then one of the people is a student who, during the war with Japan, there were no student visas allowing students from China to study graduate school or anything like that abroad. So immediately after the war happened, they started having national examinations to see who were the top students who could then get a visa and get a chance to, exchange their money so that they could go and study somewhere else. And one of those was Ho Chow, who I track here, from his childhood and how he came to be one of those top engineering students in China. He ended up at the University of Michigan as a graduate student because he wanted to study automotive engineering. And his dream was to start a car factory in China one day because they didn't produce any cars or anything like that in China. And if you wouldn't mind, I'd like to just share one little passage from Ho. Now, Ho was an engineer. He was not a real talkative guy about selecting people, but one thing Ho did do, he had an excellent memory. He could draw anything and diagram anything I asked, like, what was the family compound like where you grew up when you were a boy of 8? He drew everything for me. What was it like? Where did you live? What was the, he could draw a map for me of where he was and how he walked to school. He also kept every letter he received when he was a student here at the U of M and then later moved on to New York. Every letter from every member of his family, he kept them. And then he digitized them, scanned them, labeled them, put them on a CD, and gave me the CD. And he also kept a journal of his life, and his first trip on his first day leaving Shanghai. So I had all those things translated, and what I discovered was what a treasure trove it was, because his family members actually would write to him saying, "You can't believe what's going on here. This is incredible. One battle after another, so many people are dying. This is such a tragic time for China." I mean, his family members were really describing on a weekly basis, because they wrote a lot, of what they were seeing and what was happening. So this is, I'm going to read a very short passage from Ho's journey to America, and this is from his journal on the ship on his first day leaving Shanghai to come on his way to Michigan, to the University of Michigan. The American ship offered Ho a first glimpse into his upcoming life in America. To cool off from the heat of the sticky August day, he took a shower, his first experience with such a contraption. Nearby was a water fountain, another first. After a few cautious sips, he quenched his thirst from this amazing device that dispensed a continuous stream of clean water, no boiling necessary. In the third-class dining room, he waited in a long but orderly line for servings of sausages, potatoes, carrots, rice, bread, fruits, tea, and sugar, a precious commodity in Shanghai. The unlimited quantities stunned him, especially the sugar. That night he jotted down a new American phrase. All of this was in Chinese, but in English he jotted down a new American phrase. All you can eat. And to him that was like such a new concept. So these were my 4 characters. I also interject, I interviewed more than 100 people. Every one had the most dramatic, the most heart-wrenching, the most inspiring stories you can imagine. And I tried to take some of those and intersperse them throughout the book too.